The following is taken from our weekly clinical lecture series at Marek Health. Every week, the health coaches and partnered medical providers meet to further their education and stay as up-to-date with the clinical literature as possible. In this series, our very own Josh Lewis discusses cardiovascular training. Enjoy.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you guys for joining in on this. This is going to kind of be just based around cardiovascular training, helping patients build up their aerobic efficiency. For me personally, this is something that I've really gotten into over the last 3 to 4 years. I come from a competing background, was kind of standard meathead for many years. And when I got away from competing, I kind of wanted to do just something different and challenge myself in a different way. And so kind of fell into what you would describe, I guess, as like the hybrid style of training, really still keeping in resistance training, but also trying to improve my endurance a lot as well. And on this first slide, I've got Hunter McIntyre and Megan Jacoby, which are the two HIIT world champions at the moment. And if you guys are familiar with HIIT, I kind of feel like it's this perfect balance between being strong, but also being incredibly having awesome aerobic fitness as well. So I'm kind of highlighting and using them as an example. And a lot of my training, I guess you would say, is kind of based around how a lot of HIIT athletes go about doing theirs as well. So yeah, we'll just kind of jump into it. Okay, so first thing here, we're just kind of going to be diving into the benefits of aerobic training. Why does it matter? Why is it important? What are the adaptations that you're going to see? So really, one of the biggest things that you're going to see with a lot of aerobic training is going to be an increase in the overall number and density of mitochondria within your muscle cells, or the myocytes. So obviously, we all know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I'm sure we all retain that from high school, as the joke goes. But the more mitochondria you have means the more ability to use oxygen and produce ATP. The increase in mitochondrial efficiency is going to create more energy and also is going to lead to a greater ability to create energy using oxygen instead of resorting to glycolysis. I'm sure, as most of you are aware, using oxygen is going to be a much more efficient process to produce ATP and energy. Once we start resorting to using mostly glucose through glycolysis, eventually your body's going to kind of burn itself out. And obviously, as that next bullet point highlights, this is going to increase the ability to oxidize fat and spare glycogen by way of increased fat storage within the muscle and enhanced mobilization of free fatty acids. With this increase in mitochondria number and density, you also will see an increased insulin sensitivity and hypertrophy of type 1 muscle fibers, which is what you're primarily going to be using for aerobic style fitness or endurance exercises. You will see some hypertrophy with them up to 25%, but it's not the same that you would see with like type 2 and type 2A muscle fibers that we're primarily using for resistance training, sprinting, things of that nature. So they do grow, but it's more of just like the efficiency and mitochondrial density with them that you're going to see. And then type 1 hypertrophy is seen with aerobic work, and type 2 muscle fibers are going to be seen more with high intensity or sprint work. You'll also get an increase in ATP and glycogen storage within the muscle cells. More adaptations here. This is going to be on more of the cardiac sides and oxygen delivery. You will see an increase in left ventricle size, leading to increased stroke volume. We obviously see this with all athletes, even just resistance training. But you will also see an increase in max heart rate or a decrease due to the heart becoming more efficient. So this can kind of go one of two ways. Some athletes will get a big increase, or you'll actually see this come down just to their heart, due to their heart not having to work as hard as it used to when they were detrained. You'll also see a decrease in resting heart rate and exercise heart rate, basically just meaning your resting heart rate when you were just relaxing, but also your exercise heart rate. Think of it as, if you were doing step-ups when you were detrained, your heart rate may get up to 150. Once you become more aerobically fit, that may only increase up to 125, 130. You'll also see an increase in heart rate variability. I'm sure most of you are familiar seeing this as a stat on a lot of the fitness trackers now. This is really just those micro kind of adjustments or seconds of the amount of time in between each heartbeat. And a higher HRV typically indicates a more in shape heart, meaning it can adapt to higher and lower stress situations more rapidly. You'll also see a decrease in heart rate recovery time, just the amount of time that it takes you to recover in between sets, reps, whatever it is that you may be doing. And you'll also see an increase in total cardiac output and oxygen consumption at maximum effort, hence your VO2 max, otherwise known as that. You will most likely see a decrease in blood pressure and an increase in myoglobin, which is the protein that stores oxygen and delivers it to the muscle cell. And you'll also see an increase in angiogenesis, which is the growth of new blood vessels to support blood flow and oxygen transport to the muscle. And so now we are going to kind of get into what are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic training, as they both fall into endurance training. Use this as kind of the endurance pyramid. You'll hear a lot of endurance athletes reference this. You can kind of think of your aerobic training, where oxygen is going to be your primary energy source, is kind of the base of everything. You really want to train that to kind of be what you build everything upon of. It's your kind of diesel engine that's going to keep you moving for the longest period of time. Once you've developed a very strong aerobic system, then you can really start looking up into kind of that higher intensity stuff, which is going to move up into kind of the anaerobic, more of what you would refer to as kind of your lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold training. And at that top of the pyramid is going to be your VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen you can use for any point of exercise or whenever you're needing to push yourself the hardest. So want to make sure that you have that foundation, and then obviously building your top end fitness as well. So first we're going to get into your aerobic threshold. Primarily, you'll see zones 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 when it comes to heart rate zones whenever you're talking about endurance training. Aerobic is normally going to be zones 1 and 2. I know we talk about zone 2 here at Marek, so just getting into a little bit more of what that actually is. So think of your aerobic threshold, and aerobic training is basically the uppermost limit of exercise intensity, where the production of energy is primarily dominated by anaerobic glycolysis rather than fat oxidation. So you must have oxygen present to support the aerobic system. This is the point where blood lactate begins to raise over 2 millimoles. So whenever we're crossing over that aerobic threshold, basically just means we do not have enough oxygen to really be kind of the foundation there to support the intensity that we're going at. Fat oxidation or aerobic work is extremely efficient, is an intensity that your body could maintain for essentially hours if you had enough food, water, electrolytes, all that good stuff. And you can think of this as kind of your steady state cardio. Think of aerobic fitness as the base of your cardiovascular pyramid, as it's the most important for overall endurance. And the aerobic energy system normally kicks in around 90 seconds to 3 minutes once you start exercising. So, when you start on a run, it takes it a few minutes to kick in, just because oxygen and the aerobic energy system take a little bit longer to produce ATP, so it takes a little time to kick in. But it also is going to produce more ATP than just the anaerobic glycolysis alone. So it's around 32 versus 2 ATP if you were to compare the two systems. Although the aerobic system does produce the largest number of ATP, it's at a slower rate, and this is why your body tends to, excuse me. I apologize for the dogs, everyone. Sorry about that. Back to regular programming here. So when basically, again, this is going to be why your body resorts to ATP, it's not going to resort to your aerobic system at first, and it turns on your anaerobic glycolysis for its main fuel source with higher intensity short bursts of activities, sprints, heavy lifts, things of that nature. So next we're going to be looking at anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold, and VO2 max. This is going to be more zones 3, 4, and 5. So anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold is the highest sustained intensity for which oxygen uptake can account for the entire energy required, meaning the highest intensity you can sustain without blood lactate building up to an amount that it affects performance. Anaerobic and lactate threshold will increase with cardiovascular training, due to the mitochondrial efficiency in recycling lactate into pyruvate via the liver, which is then converted back to glucose for ATP production. So basically, when you're at your anaerobic threshold, this is where your body kind of is at that teetering point to where it is combining oxygen and anaerobic glycolysis to support itself. But there is a point that once you cross over that anaerobic threshold, your body will not have enough oxygen to kind of split between the two. And eventually you will build up too much lactate to where your body cannot clear it in an efficient manner back to pyruvate and then back into glucose. And this is basically where your performance will start to teeter off. So, you're kind of like this is where like the, I guess, top end of what you can hold for a long period of time. And then after that, you're kind of to the point of diminishing returns. Zone 3, 4, and 5 is where you'll see the most benefits in increasing that anaerobic threshold and lactate threshold. The higher the intensity, the more the body will start to, I'm getting a little feedback there. Thank you. The higher the intensity, the more the body will start to rely on glucose as its main fuel source. Your VO2 max, which a lot of us think of with your high intensity training, only calculates the maximum amount of oxygen which the body is able to use during exercise, but it does not account what your anaerobic or lactate threshold is going to be. So VO2 max will increase with high intensity work, but if you were to take two athletes with the same VO2 max, but different anaerobic and lactate thresholds, their top end performance is going to be much different. Basically, the person with the higher lactate threshold is going to be able to perform that harder endurance exercise for much longer while also having the same amount of peak performance. And lactate threshold is typically around 75 to 90% of your max heart rate. All right, so next we're going to kind of get into why strength athletes need aerobic training, vice versa, and then the interference effects. So, how do we combine these together without decreasing performance from both sides of the aisle? How do we kind of explain this to patients? So the first one is going to be why strength athletes need aerobic training. Again, I come from a background of all strength training, so this is why I really dove into this the last couple of years. And just anecdotally speaking, it's been amazing from a performance standpoint, health standpoint, how much it has allowed me to almost improve my strength training as well, just my ability to recover in between sets, things of that nature. So resistance training by itself does have many benefits, as that we're all aware of, but actually can decrease mitochondrial density by the way of muscular hypertrophy. So if you're thinking about it, if we're just growing those muscle fibers, but not actually increasing the density or size of the mitochondria to go alongside of it, that ratio is actually going to get skewed. So you have a really big, strong muscle that does not really have any endurance with it. And obviously we all have seen very muscular individuals that are super strong for a few reps, but struggle getting up a flight of stairs or take a long time to recover in between sets. So we really don't want that. We kind of want the best of both worlds there. Many strength athletes or strength only athletes can have poor mitochondrial health and efficiency due to an underdeveloped aerobic system. Developing the aerobic system will allow for improved blood flow and nutrient delivery to the working muscle. You will also see a decrease in vagal tone, which will lead to a decreased resting heart rate, vasoconstriction, and sympathetic nervous system at rest. This is key for many of our enhanced athletes, as well as our larger strength athletes. You're already putting a large sympathetic stress on yourself, especially when there's exogenous androgens involved, just being a higher body weight, carrying a lot of muscle mass. So anything we can do to increase that aerobic efficiency will help decrease the demand that is put on their body just to do normal activities. And you'll also see an increase in work capacity for higher intensity, high rep sets by allowing for greater oxygen delivery and the ability to recover in between sets. And next is going to be why endurance athletes need resistance training. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, many endurance athletes have underdeveloped muscle tone and type 2 fibers, which can lead to injury over the long term by strengthening muscles, tendons, ligaments, and increasing bone mineral density. As we're all aware, most marathon runners or long distance runners were used to seen as very skinny individuals. And a lot of them are plagued with injuries and things like that, just because they never really work on developing any strength to support what they're doing. And running is obviously a very demanding sport from a muscle standpoint. So you need to have basically the structure there to support it as well. You will also see an increase in peak velocity at higher intensities via increased muscle power and size. So really their top end performance for endurance athletes. You'll also see improved anaerobic capacity by strength training, improving glycolysis, phosphocreatine stores within the muscle, and the buffering capacity of lactic acid. You'll also see an increased movement economy by the way of increased muscle strength. So the athlete is getting peak power out of each stride, pedal stroke, whatever the endurance sport may be. Basically just meaning that they're actually going to be able to move through the movement in a more efficient manner and get the most bang for their buck out of every stride, swim, pedal stroke, whatever it may be. And finally, you're going to see an enhanced neuromuscular function via the motor unit recruitment and muscular coordination adaptations that occur as a result of resistance training. This is obviously something we always harp on with just anyone starting out with kind of those newbie gains, that a lot of it is just kind of that enhanced neuromuscular function that they're recruiting. But you'll see this with a lot of endurance athletes as well that have never strength trained before. They're going to get that added benefit as well. All right, so next we're going to get into the interference effect. So basically, how do we combine both of these together, again, without it really hindering one or the other? The interference effect is the phenomenon where cardiovascular and strength training start to work against each other by decreasing performance in both camps. High intensity or steady state endurance work should be performed earlier in the day or at least 3 hours apart from resistance training. Endurance work tends to produce a peak in AMPK, which is activated protein kinase, which is essentially catabolic in nature and actually can reduce cell growth and proliferation, which from a resistance training standpoint, that is not what we want. So you're kind of wanting to give that buffer of at least 3 hours, splitting them apart. This is obviously the opposite effect that we see with mTOR, which normally peaks after any type of resistance training, which puts the body in an anabolic or growth phase and can last up to 18 hours after training. Optimizing nutrition is going to be huge for athletes that are combining both of these styles of training, especially regarding their protein intake, which is going to allow for greater recovery and muscle protein synthesis post-resistance training. Another huge thing is going to be replenishing glycogen stores, especially when you are adding an endurance effort or endurance training. You definitely want to have good or filled up glycogen stores that are going to allow you to then to continue to support your strength training and not allow you or not basically make it to where you're going to see a decrease in strength or power. And a few more keys here on how to minimize it. Volume and intensity are really going to be the two most important factors here. So low intensity or zone 1 and 2 cardio up around to 2.5 hours per week is not really shown to have a negative effect on strength training. But if you were to do the same volume with intensities above lactate threshold, so getting up into that higher end of aerobic work, you do start to show some negative impact on strength gains. So again, it's really just about kind of keeping the intensity low enough to where you are not going to decrease your performance when it comes to resistance training. Low aerobic cardio training prior to resistance training, think of a slow incline treadmill walk, has actually been shown to have no negative impact on strength adaptations and actually can increase endurance adaptations. So a simple warm-up, 10 to 15 minutes, walking on the treadmill, things of that nature are not going to hinder your resistance training performance. Untrained individuals are actually less likely to experience the interference effect when just starting out, probably just based upon the fact that they are not going to be training it as at high a volume as someone who is much more trained. So they're probably going to have that natural balance of splitting both. But performance athletes should have a more fine-tuned approach that has the bulk of their training kind of focused on what of their specific goals are, whether that's going to be power and strength, aerobic training specifically, whatever it may be. You just want to use the opposite style of training to kind of fill in the gaps and just really support what their prospective sport is going to be. And so again, there at the bottom to kind of summarize, you just want to find the minimal effective dose to really get the benefits, but again, not decrease performance with whatever it is that they're chasing after. Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of building a program for patients. What does that look like? What are recommendations? We can just give them from a general standpoint. At the beginning, we kind of touched on aerobic threshold, zone 1 and 2 training. We even have that obviously in our sheets that we send out to patients, giving them cardio training tips. But zone 2 work should be the foundation, the base of the pyramid, like we talked about. Zone 2 can be defined as when there is enough oxygen to support your aerobic energy system. Focusing on zone 2 is where you'll get most of the mitochondrial adaptations and increase your overall endurance. And this is typically going to be found anywhere between 60 to 75% of your max heart rate. And so, kind of finding out, what that zone 2 is going to look like for you. There are a few ways to do it. Obviously, you can use heart rate monitors, but for people that do not have a Apple Watch, Garmin watch, heart rate monitor, there's a couple different kind of formulas that you can use. The Maffetone method is one that a lot of endurance athletes use, and this is simply just going to be 180 minus your age. Whatever that number is, that's basically going to calculate what your aerobic threshold is going to be. So for me, I'm 27 years old, so mine would be 153. Basically, with all of my zone 2 training, I try and keep my heart rate under 153 beats per minute and really keep my average down at about 10 beats per minute less than that. So around 140 to 143 beats per minute to make sure that I'm not crossing over into those anaerobic threshold territories. The talk test is another great tool. Basically, you should be able to hold a conversation with the person that is next to you. It can feel strained. It's not going to feel comfortable, but it should be to where you can still complete full sentences without having to gasp for air between each one. For many untrained individuals, zone 2 can actually be found at a brisk walk, so make sure intensity is not too high. A lot of people just kind of go out and think that, oh, I'm just going to jog or something like that. But again, if you've never done any of this type of training, it's really a good idea to kind of maybe invest in a heart rate monitor, things like that, and just try out different exercises, a brisk walk, hiking, whatever it may be, to kind of see what gets your heart rate up into that zone 2 zone or into that zone 2 area. And then next is going to be high intensity training, as this is obviously something we do not want to neglect. We want to build that pyramid, but then your high end performance as well. High intensity training is normally going to be performed in intervals at around 30 seconds to 4-minute intervals. A 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 work to rest ratio is a great starting point. So let's say a 2-minute sprint followed by a 1-minute walk in between right into another 2-minute sprint. A proper zone 2 warm up and cool down is extremely important here, as you want to definitely get the body primed for these higher intensity exercises. I always like to recommend a minimum of 5 minutes for both. And with that warm up and cool down included, aim for 1 20-minute high intensity session a week starting out. And then obviously more trained individuals can work up to a 30 to 45-minute session or break those up into 2 shorter sessions throughout the week. Shorter efforts can actually be around 90 to 95% of your max heart rate, 30 seconds to 1 minute. So that's really when you're getting after it. There's no issues with that. But longer intervals should be around your lactate threshold at around that 75 to 90% of your max heart rate. So anything that's going to be over that 1 minute, kind of that 2 to 4 minute mark. And training at high intensities will increase your lactate threshold and allow you to hold harder efforts for sustained amount of times. And a good kind of, rule of thumb that you'll see throughout the endurance community is an 80-20 rule, basically meaning how much percentage of time you're going to dedicate to zone 2 and then high intensity training. So 80% is going to be that zone 1-2 training, really building that base. 20% of the time is where you're going to be working on that higher intensity stuff. And so this is just kind of like a, mock template that I kind of put up. And this is something that I use for people just if they're kind of asking me how to get into it here, as far as like starting out with their aerobic training. This first one is going to be for the untrained individual. So something as simple as 3 30-minute zone 2 cardio sessions. These can be continuous or broken up. So that could be 3 10-minute walks per day, and then 2 to 3 full body resistance training sessions per week. This is normally a good starting point, something that is not going to burn them out and will allow them to adhere to the program. And then for moderately trained individuals, 3 to 4 30-minute zone 2 cardio sessions per week is a great starting point. If they are moderately trained, I like to try and see this as, their continuous sessions, they can at least hold that for 30 minutes. without stopping. Obviously, you can break it up if you need to, but you're going to get more of those mitochondrial kind of benefits and things of that nature once you start getting into the continuous effort like that. And then a 20-minute high intensity cardio session per week, and then also 3 full body resistance training sessions per week. And then for the highly trained individual that really wants to get the most bang for their buck, 4 30 to 45-minute zone 2 sessions, continuous in nature, and then 1 30 to 45-minute high intensity session. And again, this can be split up into 2 bouts, and then 3 full body resistance training sessions per week. And then down at the bottom, you'll see for all levels, be sure to include some static and dynamic stretching for mobility and stability work, especially when it comes to aerobic training. A lot of people neglect this side of it, and that's kind of where you see injuries stack up, because it is normally a repetitive motion for lots and lots of reps, whether that's biking, swimming, running. You're going to be doing a lot more RPMs than you're going to be doing with the bench press or when you're resistance training. So a little more demanding on your body in certain areas with, whatever you may be using, like your shoulders for swimming, legs for running. So just really want to make sure that you're keeping yourself limber to support as you combine these styles of training. All right, and last few slides here, we're just going to get into some modalities. I'm sure when most of us think about aerobic training, we're going to think about running. Me personally, this is my choice as far as what I like to do, but it's actually the one that I push people away from starting out, just because you will see the most injuries start. Most people have never learned to run efficiently or correctly. We all just kind of ran as kids or through sport, and that's kind of how we do now. So you'll see here I put the most common form of cardio, but it's the most likely to lead to injury and possibly an interference effect, just because it's also going to be the most high stress. Your legs are certainly going to be taking a beating in comparison to other forms of cardio. So I try and limit this to really the more trained athletes that want to get into endurance or long endurance running. Running is the highest impact form of cardio. It's going to put the most significant muscle strain on the lower body, and it requires not only lower body strength, but stability and coordination to support proper running form. If running is the modality of choice, one should start with run walking for an untrained individual while working on lower body strength and stability. Foot strengthening exercises are also really huge here. Most of us have very poor foot strength, just the way that our shoes are designed. We don't do a lot of barefoot walking, obviously, with the way that our lifestyles are now. So really working on that foot strength can be a huge way just to support proper form and keep from any injuries developing down the road from overuse. And if strength training is the goal, like that's going to be their primary focus, I tell everybody to really only stay around 8 to 10 miles max a week. Just kind of, it seems like once you get over that, you really can start to see that interference effect. And generally, that's going to be around that 2 to 2.5 hour mark per week mark that we talked about earlier. Increased cadence and improving foot strike patterns can really help with your running economy and prevent injury. So with running, I try and tell everybody, like, we think of like striding it out is probably the best way, but in actuality, you want to have much shorter strides, trying to hit the mid part of your foot and really just keeping a quick turnover. That just keeps you from overstriding, heel striking, and puts a lot less stress on your knees, ankles, things of that nature, and actually is a much more efficient way for you to run. So that's why things like a Garmin watch or Apple Watch are great, because you can kind of track your cadence. And a good rule of thumb for most people, I didn't put it on here, but is anywhere between 160 to 180 steps per minute as far as your cadence whenever you're running or jogging. And then other modalities are going to be biking, swimming, rowing machine, and ski erg. Obviously, there's many more that we could throw on here, but just wanted to use kind of these 4 as they're normally the most accessible. Most gyms are going to have these machines or a swimming pool, or most people will have access to a bike to ride outside or a stationary bike. All of them are great cardio modalities that are very low impact and much easier to train at a low aerobic intensity. With running, it's much easier to kind of cross over that threshold because it is a higher impact type of activity. But with biking and swimming, rowing machine, ski erg, you can kind of find your rhythm and find where that zone 2 is going to be and just stay there. A lot of times it's going to be indoors, so you're not fighting the heat and the humidity and the elements. So it just seems for like most people, as they're kind of finding what that zone 2 is going to look like for them, these are more of a good place to start. They all come with their own unique movement patterns. and patients should obviously work to become efficient in whichever they choose to do, so they avoid injury. Same with biking, or same just like with running, biking, swimming, the rowing machine, and the ski erg all have efficient ways about going about doing them. So really learning how to get your form down is going to let you get the most bang for your buck and not hurt yourself over the long term. And choose the modality that is most comfortable and most likely to make the patient adhere to a cardio program. Maybe none of these are what they like. So, if hiking ends up being their modality of choice or whatever it is, you just want to choose something that obviously they're much more likely to stick to and not going to get bored with or obviously go off track. Most of these modalities can be performed indoors, like we talked about. And then indoor bike, row machine, and ski erg can be great additions to combine with your resistance training to kind of help work on that lactate clearance and aerobic efficiency in between sets. So for example, sometimes if I'm doing something like a push-up, I'll throw in a ski erg as a superset with that. It kind of a zone 2 intensity, and that just kind of helps work out that lactic acid in my upper body, help me recycle it, kind of reload your system. And, essentially it's giving you the bang for your buck there, that you're obviously getting stronger, but working on your aerobic efficiency at the same time, and basically making it to where you can clear that lactate and hop back into your next set and kind of feel like you've recovered, but you're also getting the aerobic benefit there as well. All right, and to summarize here, so regardless of the goal, performance, hypertrophy, strength, or general health, cardiovascular training is going to be a must for all. You're going to see an increase in aerobic efficiency is critical for heart and metabolic health. Increasing aerobic efficiency will benefit performance in numerous ways, not just in, kind of your overall strength, but your ability to recover, your top end performance, the list goes on. Zone 2 work is going to be the most critical and should be the foundation. You should find modalities that are enjoyable and keep the activity fun. And you should tailor the program to the individual's needs and goals. Heart rate monitors are great tools, but it's important to learn intensity based off of feel. This was kind of the mistake I made when I first started out, getting too into the gadgets. It's really good to kind of learn, what does zone 2 feel like for me? When I'm just really in that aerobic level, when I get into those higher intensities, can I sense what that is like once I get there? Because you're not always going to have access to those. So just kind of learning where those zones are by feel is a really great thing for all people to do. And if you're combining resistance training and cardiovascular training, make sure to fuel properly and schedule training so that they do not negatively impact one another.